Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
You know that gut punch when your phone stays silent for too long and suddenly the what-ifs turn into a drive you can't ignore, especially when it's your own flesh and blood. Well, that's how it started for me 2 weeks ago with my son David not picking up, and what I found in that house still keeps me up at night shaking, because nothing prepares a mother for the moment reality unravels under a kid's bed. So there I was staring at my phone that morning, the screen mocking me with those unanswered texts piling up like unread library books nobody wanted after 14 days of radio silence from David, my 35-year-old son, who lived just an hour's drive away in that quiet Columbus suburb, and I couldn't shake the worry gnawing at my insides like a bad case of heartburn after too much diner coffee, because David had always been the independent type, the one who moved out at 20 to chase some engineering job that promised big things, but delivered mostly late nights and vague excuses. And now, with my 8-year-old grandson Tommy in the mix after David's messy divorce 2 years back, every missed call felt like a crack in the family foundation I'd spent decades patching up since my husband passed from that sudden heart attack, leaving me to handle these worries alone in my little ranch house, surrounded by shelves of forgotten novels that offered no real answers to the fears bubbling up inside me. I tossed the phone onto the kitchen counter, grabbed my keys, and decided right then that waiting around like some damsel in a bad Hallmark movie wasn't my style, because mothers don't get do-overs, and something in my bones whispered this wasn't just him being busy with work or dodging bill collectors again. So I headed out to the car, the old sedan that had carried us through family vacations to the lake up north, where David used to fish for hours with his dad, now reduced to hauling me on these worry-driven errands through the gray Ohio sky that matched my mood perfectly as the highway stretched out with endless fields blurring past while I replayed our last conversation in my head, him sounding distracted on the line about some new project at the lab, nothing specific, but enough to make me wonder if he was in over his head again like that time he borrowed money from my savings for a sure-thing investment that turned out to be a scam run by one of his so-called friends, leaving me scraping by on library wages and instant noodles for months, which still made me chuckle bitterly to myself, a dry laugh that echoed in the empty car, thinking how I'd always been the straight shooter in the family, the one organizing block potlucks and volunteering at the library, while he dreamed big and stumbled often, but lately his updates had dried up completely. No pictures of Tommy's soccer games or those goofy videos of the kid building forts out of couch cushions that used to brighten my quiet evenings after closing up the stacks. By the time I pulled into the driveway of his two-story colonial, the kind of place that looked picture-perfect from the street with its neat lawn and American flag fluttering on the porch, but hid all sorts of secrets behind vinyl siding, my hands were gripping the wheel a little too tight, and that's when I noticed the neighbor across the way, Mrs. Hargrove, peering out her curtains like she was auditioning for the neighborhood watch Gestapo, always the type to gossip about David's odd hours at that research firm, or how the divorce had turned him into a hermit, raising Tommy single-handedly without much help from his ex, who had skipped town for a fresh start in California, leaving behind only child support checks that barely covered the basics. The house loomed quiet, David's old pickup truck parked crooked in the drive as if he'd pulled in too fast and forgotten about it in some haze of exhaustion, and I stepped out into the crisp fall air, my sneakers crunching on the gravel path that hadn't been weeded in weeks, which wasn't like him at all, since Tommy loved playing out there chasing fireflies in the summer evenings or raking leaves into piles for jumping, which made my chest tighten with that familiar mix of love and frustration, because ignoring the yard meant ignoring the little routines that kept life grounded for a boy his age. I knocked on the front door, calling out, "David, it's Mom, you home?" But only silence answered, the kind that presses in on you like a heavy blanket, smothering any hope of normalcy. So I used the spare key he'd given me years ago for emergencies, like the time Tommy got sick with the flu and David was stuck in traffic, turning it with a click that felt too loud in the stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath waiting for my intrusion. Pushing inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell, not the usual bachelor pad funk of pizza boxes and unwashed laundry that I'd teased him about during visits, but something sharper, almost metallic, mixed with a damp earthiness that reminded me of the basement after a heavy rainstorm, unnatural for a house kept so tidy, with Tommy's toys usually lined up on shelves and David's tools organized in the garage like a mechanic's dream. I flicked on the hallway light, the bulb buzzing faintly as I called again, my voice bouncing off the walls lined with family photos, me holding baby David at his baptism with that proud smile, Tommy grinning toothless at his first birthday party where we'd all worn silly hats and laughed until our sides hurt, and that's when I heard it, a soft shuffle from upstairs, like feet dragging across carpet, or maybe just the house settling under the weight of autumn winds, but it pulled me toward the stairs. Anyway, heart picking up pace because Tommy's room was up there, and what if the kid was sick or hurt, and that's why David hadn't called, leaving me to imagine the worst, like a fever spiking or an accident in the yard that no one noticed in time. Wandering through the living room, I noticed the little things that set my teeth on edge, the coffee table cluttered with takeout wrappers from that Chinese place on Main Street, but no plates washed in the sink where usually David left everything spotless to set a good example. Tommy's backpack slumped by the couch like it had been dropped in a hurry after school, and a half-finished drawing on the floor, crayons scattered everywhere showing what looked like a stick figure family, but with extra limbs on the boy that didn't make sense at first glance, twisting in ways that hinted at something playful gone wrong, or maybe just a child's imagination running wild after too many cartoons about superheroes battling aliens. I picked it up frowning, because Tommy was all about bright colors and clear lines, not these weird scribbles that seemed to blend the figures into shadows, and as I climbed the stairs slowly the smell grew stronger, clinging to the air like it was seeping from the walls themselves, making me pause at the landing to wonder if I should call the police or at least my sister back in Cleveland before going further, but no, that felt like overreacting, like admitting I couldn't handle my own family without turning it into a three-ring circus, so I pushed on toward Tommy's door, cracked open just enough to spill a sliver of darkness into the hall where Mrs. Hargrove's prying eyes from earlier flashed in my mind, her always gossiping about David's secretive late nights, and how the house lights stayed on until dawn, suggesting all sorts of nonsense from affairs to worse. So before venturing in, I stepped back to the window, spotted her still watching from her porch rocking chair, and with a grin that felt more like grit born from years of dealing with busybodies, I waved cheerfully before ducking down to chuck a handful of pebbles at her pristine lawn ornaments, the ceramic gnomes and bird baths toppling like dominoes in a satisfying clatter, while she sputtered inside, clutching her robe, one less nosy neighbor to deal with while I figured this out on my own terms. Then, steeling myself with a deep breath that did little to calm the racing thoughts, I nudged Tommy's door wider, the shuffle sounding again, closer now from under the bed, pulling me into the unknown with a mix of dread and that stubborn determination that had gotten me through widowhood and empty nests alike. That shuffle under Tommy's bed stopped me cold in the doorway, the darkness in the room swallowing the light from the hall like it was hungry for every last ray spilling across the threshold, but I shook off the chill running down my spine, the kind that prickles your skin like static from a wool sweater on a dry winter day, and stepped inside anyway, flipping the switch only to have the bulb flicker once before steadying its weak glow, casting long shadows across the posters of dinosaurs and space shuttles that David had hung years ago to spark the kid's imagination during those long evenings when work kept him late and Tommy needed distractions to keep from missing his mom, who had bolted after the divorce, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and court dates that still haunted our family gatherings, with awkward silences broken only by forced small talk about the weather or school projects. The smell was thicker here, almost cloying, like wet leaves piled up after a storm, mixed with something chemical that burned the back of my throat, reminding me of the old science kits David used to beg for as a boy, bubbling away in the garage until one exploded in a cloud of acrid smoke that had us airing out the house for days. But this felt different, more invasive, seeping into the fibers of the carpet and curtains as if the house itself was exhaling some hidden rot, and I scanned the room, quickly noting the unmade bed with its spaceship comforter bunched up in disarray, toys scattered across the floor as if playtime had been interrupted mid-battle, with plastic soldiers toppled over like fallen comrades, and no sign of the boy himself, which twisted my stomach into knots, because Tommy was supposed to be at school by now, or at least that's what David usually texted about on Mondays, those quick updates about packed lunches and bus rides that made me feel connected despite the miles between us, even if they often came laced with exhaustion from his double shifts at the biotech firm, where he tinkered with gadgets that sounded too futuristic for a man still struggling to pay the mortgage. I called his name softly, at first, "Tommy, Grandma's here, where are you, buddy?" Then louder, my voice cracking slightly with the weight of unspoken fears. But only echoes came back, bouncing off the walls cluttered with his drawings, more of those odd ones pinned up haphazardly with figures that had too many eyes or arms blending into the background like shadows come alive, nothing like the bright colors and clear lines he usually favored in his superhero sketches that we'd frame and hang in my kitchen to brighten the lonely mornings after the library opened early for story hour. Moving carefully around the clutter, I checked the closet, pushing aside clothes that smelled musty as if they'd been shut up too long without a fresh wash, the hangers scraping against the rod with a sound that set my nerves jangling, then the bathroom down the hall where toothpaste dotted the sink in lazy splatters, but no toothbrush in its holder, and the towel bar empty, as if someone had grabbed it in a hurry, leaving behind damp footprints that trailed toward the stairs, my mind racing through possibilities like a hamster on a wheel. Maybe David took him to visit his ex-wife, unannounced, in some misguided attempt at reconciliation, or they were at a doctor's appointment for one of Tommy's recurring ear infections that always flared up with the changing seasons, but the house felt too abandoned for that. The fridge downstairs humming alone with milk that had gone sour when I peeked earlier, its date stamped 2 weeks back, aligning perfectly with the last time I'd heard from them, and a loaf of bread molding on the counter that no one had bothered to toss out, which wasn't like David at all, the neat freak who'd inherited his father's obsession with order even in chaos. I sank onto the edge of the bed for a moment, the mattress dipping under my weight with a sigh of springs that echoed my own weariness, and that's when I spotted it, a small notebook wedged between the frame and the nightstand, its cover worn from little hands thumbing through pages filled with David's handwriting, notes about Phase 2 containment and sketches of containment fields that looked ripped straight from a sci-fi novel, not the practical engineering reports he used to share over Sunday dinners with diagrams of bridges and circuits that made my eyes glaze over, but this stuff delved into neural interfaces and symbiotic links. Words that sent a prickle of unease through me, suggesting he'd been hiding experiments in the basement, perhaps crossing lines at work that explained the smell and the silence, a realization that made me laugh out bitterly, thinking how he'd always chased these wild ideas since college, convincing himself he was onto breakthroughs that would change everything from healthcare to everyday life. But this felt different, more secretive, like he'd been playing with fire in the dark corners of the house where Tommy's laughter used to fill the air, and part of me wanted to storm down there right then to demand answers and shut it all down, but the memory of his failed ventures held me back, making me wonder if I was jumping to conclusions again the way I had when I loaned him that money for the investment scam and ended up eating ramen for months, scraping by on my pension and odd jobs at the library, while he promised to make it right someday. The front door creaked downstairs, then snapping me alert like a twig underfoot in the woods, and I tucked the notebook into my pocket, the paper crinkling against my jeans, before creeping to the window, peering out through the blinds to see David's landlord, Mr. Wilkins, that greasy opportunist with the comb-over and cheap suits who owned half the block and had a reputation for squeezing tenants dry, poking around the yard like he owned the place, already his eyes darting to the windows as if casing the joint for valuables to auction off. He'd been hounding David about rent for weeks, I knew from overheard calls during my last visit, threatening eviction, even though the payments were current, probably angling for a flip on the rising Columbus market, where houses like this fetched top dollar from young families fleeing the city. And as he jimmied the mailbox with a tool that looked suspiciously like a lockpick, I felt that familiar firelight in my chest, the kind that made me protective to a fault, the mama bear instinct kicking in hard against anyone messing with my own. Slipping downstairs quietly, my footsteps muffled on the carpet, I waited until he was close to the porch, then flung the door open with a forced smile that didn't reach my eyes, startling him so bad he dropped his keys clattering onto the steps, and before he could bluster about checking for damage or some other excuse, I laid into him with the story I'd pieced together on the spot, how I'd seen him skulking around last week, prying into private mail, how the neighborhood association was onto his shady side hustles, evicting folks on technicalities to line his pockets, and capped it by accidentally spilling my travel mug of coffee on his polished shoes, the dark stains spreading like justice across the leather, while I apologized profusely, my eyes twinkling with mischief, because nothing says revenge like a hot mess on a cold day, leaving him hopping mad and storming off, muttering threats that carried no weight, now his comb-over askew and dignity in tatters. He retreated to his car, defeated for the moment, but as I locked the door behind me, turning the deadbolt with a satisfying thunk, the shuffle echoed again from upstairs, pulling me back like an invisible thread, and this time when I entered Tommy's room the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation, and a shadow definitely shifted under the bed, slow and deliberate, like whatever was there knew I was watching and waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The shadow under Tommy's bed stretched unnaturally long in the flickering light from the hallway, making the room feel smaller, more confined, like the walls were closing in with every breath I took, but I couldn't tear myself away from that spot, the metallic tang in the air growing sharper, almost like ozone after a thunderstorm, mixed with the faint coppery hint of blood that no mother ever wants to imagine lingering in her grandson's space, where toys and bedtime stories should be the only sense hanging around. And as I knelt down slowly, my knees protesting against the worn carpet that had seen better days from all of Tommy's romping around, I reached for the edge of the comforter, dangling there like a veil hiding secrets no family should have to uncover. My mind flashing back to all those nights I'd read to David about monsters under the bed when he was little, insisting they were just stories to chase away the dark, but now here I was, hand trembling as I gripped the fabric, whispering, "Tommy, if that's you playing one of your games, you better come out right now, because Grandma's not in the mood for hide-and-seek today." But deep down in that pit of my stomach, I knew it wasn't him. The air felt too charged, humming faintly like the old fluorescent lights in the library basement that always buzzed before burning out and left me fumbling in the dark for the switch. I lifted the blanket inch by inch, the dust bunnies scattering across the floor like guilty little secrets fleeing the light, and when the face, or what passed for one, came into view, my hands started shaking so bad I nearly dropped the whole thing, crumpling to the floor, because staring back wasn't Tommy with his freckles scattered like stars and that gap-toothed grin that lit up family holidays, but something pale and elongated, eyes too large and reflective, catching the light in a way that sent shivers racing up my arms, mimicking a child's form, but wrong in every single contour, like a puppet stitched together from half-remembered nightmares and stolen memories. Its skin, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that didn't quite align with anything human. I scrambled back, banging my elbow hard on the bed frame, the pain shooting through me like fire, but it barely registered over the roar in my ears as that thing blinked slowly, its mouth curving in what might have been a smile, or just the awkward pull of unfamiliar muscles trying to imitate emotion. And in that frozen second, fragments of David's notebook flooded my thoughts, the mentions of symbiotic integration and dates that lined up exactly with when the calls stopped, suggesting he'd been tinkering with something forbidden at that biotech firm, perhaps a government-backed project on neural enhancements that had gone horribly awry, bringing this abomination into their home, replacing Tommy in some twisted experiment meant to push the boundaries of science, but ending up blurring the line between man and machine, or worse, something from beyond. Laughter bubbled up, unbidden, hysterical, and edged with that dark humor I developed after my husband's funeral, when friends tiptoed around the grief like it was fragile china, but I knew better how to laugh through the ache, thinking how David always had to push those boundaries, turning our family barbecues into impromptu lectures on quantum fields and biofeedback that left everyone nodding politely while sneaking extra potato salad. But this was no joke. This was my blood twisted into something alien, unrecognizable, and invasive, making me want to scream for help, to dial 911 and let the professionals with their flashing lights and protocols handle the nightmare, yet the fear of them bursting and carting David off as a mad scientist, or worse, dissecting the boy I loved under sterile lamps, kept me silent, a choice that even I recognized as foolish, clinging desperately to the hope that I could fix it myself, like I'd patched up every other family crisis, from overdrawn bank accounts to teenage rebellions, without ever asking for a handout. Voices murmured from the hallway, then low and urgent, pulling me to my feet as I yanked the blanket back down over the thing, its form twitching slightly under the cover like it was settling in for the long haul. And one of those voices sounded just like David's, tired and strained, arguing with someone about containment breach and retrieval timelines, while the other was sharper, more clipped, female, maybe his coworker from the lab that one time she'd visited unannounced, eyeing the house like she was assessing inventory for a catalog, and dismissing Tommy's drawings with a sniff about distractions from real progress. I slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind me, the latch clicking like a secret sealed, and crept down the hall toward the stairs where the conversation grew clearer, snippets drifting up about how the entity had bonded too deeply with the host, neural patterns intertwining in ways the models hadn't predicted, confirming my worst fears that this wasn't some simple kidnapping or accident, but an invasive force slipping into our world through David's ambition-fueled carelessness at work, where ethics committees probably rubber-stamped ideas that sounded like science fiction, but carried real risks to innocent lives like my grandson's. Down in the kitchen, I hovered near the basement door, cracked open just enough to overhear more the woman Dr. Lena Voss, as David addressed her, emerging first into the light, all sharp suits and condescending glances that swept over me like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture in my own son's home, accusing him of negligence in the home trials she'd authorized herself to cut costs and timelines, her voice dripping with that corporate venom that treated people like disposable lab rats rather than flesh and blood. And when she turned to me, dismissing my presence with a wave and a mutter about family matters being secondary to the project's integrity, I saw my opening. That smugness practically begging for a takedown, born from years of watching opportunists like her climb over good people to protect their own hides. Feigning wide-eyed concern, I offered her a cup of coffee from the pot still warm on the counter, laced with just enough of that over-the-counter laxative I'd stashed in my purse from nursing my sister's endless stomach issues, a harmless but effective trick that had her excusing herself to the bathroom within minutes, doubled over and pale, while I cornered David in the living room for a hurried explanation, his words tumbling out about the prototype's failure and the need to contain it before it spread. But just as he started detailing the reversal process, a child's voice called out "Grandma" from upstairs, too perfect, too echoing, slicing through the air and sending ice flooding through my veins, because it came from the room where the thing still lurked, waiting. That voice calling Grandma from Tommy's room sliced through the tension in the kitchen like a knife, cutting through the thick fog of confusion and fear that had settled over us all, making my heart slam against my ribs as if it were trying to escape the chest that suddenly felt too tight for all the questions piling up inside. And I pushed past David, his face still ashen from the confrontation with Dr. Voss, who was now barricaded in the bathroom, cursing under her breath about the coffee that had turned her insides into a battlefield, while the mimic upstairs waited with its eerie imitation hanging in the air like a taunt from some forgotten horror movie we used to watch on late-night cable when David was a teen, insisting it was all fake effects and rubber suits. But now the reality of it clawed at me, demanding I face the fractured truth that my grandson wasn't just missing or sick, but altered in ways that blurred the lines between flesh and whatever digital nightmare his father had unleashed in pursuit of redemption from those mounting debts and the sting of divorce that had left him isolated in this house with only half-baked experiments for company. We hurried up the stairs together, David's hand brushing mine in a rare moment of vulnerability that reminded me of the boy who'd clung to me after his first bike crash, scraping knees and promising he'd never ride again, only to pedal off the next day with Band-Aids fluttering like flags of defiance. But this time there was no quick fix, no scraped elbows to kiss better, as the door to Tommy's room creaked open under my push, revealing the blanket still draped over the bed, but the shape beneath more defined, now shifting restlessly as if agitated by our presence, the air humming with that unnatural charge that made the hairs on my arms stand up like I'd walked into a storm cloud. And David muttered something about it being a prototype interface, his words tumbling out in a rush laced with technical jargon about the lab's Neuralink technology, originally designed for medical miracles like restoring movement to paralyzed veterans or bridging gaps for stroke survivors, but glitched catastrophically during a home test, with Tommy merging the boy's innocent neural patterns with an AI construct that now mimicked him with eerie precision from a remote server, while leaving this hybrid shell behind, a grotesque placeholder that explained the drawings, the smell, and the silence stretching back 2 weeks into the void of unanswered calls. My stomach churned violently at the confession, picturing my lively grandson strapped to some makeshift rig in the basement, his laughter reduced to lines of code flickering on screens, while this thing puppeteered his room, and I rounded on David with questions firing like accusations from a prosecutor. Why hadn't he reached out for real help instead of hiding behind secrecy? Why risk the kid's very essence for a shot at glory or financial salvation from the divorce alimony that drained his paycheck like a leaky faucet, but he just hung his head, sweat beading on his forehead, admitting the debts had piled up from her lawyer's fees and the house payments, forcing him to cut corners on safety protocols, promising over and over that it was reversible. If we could just contain the entity overnight and extract the core data before it integrated further, a dilemma that tore at my resolve, because trusting his word meant delaying the authorities who could swoop in with experts and equipment. To save Tommy for real, yet calling the cops or even 911 risked exposing David's role in the breach, turning him into the villain in a story splashed across local news with headlines about mad scientists and child endangerment that would shatter our family beyond repair, leaving me to pick up the pieces alone again, like after the funeral when I sold half my books to cover the medical bills. Downstairs, Dr. Voss had recovered enough to pace the living room, her sharp heels clicking like accusations on the hardwood phone clutched in her manicured hand as she threatened to report the entire breach to the firm's board and the regulatory bodies that oversaw such classified work, her voice rising in pitch with that corporate venom, treating the situation like a spreadsheet error rather than a life-altering catastrophe. And as she grilled David relentlessly about failed protocols and unauthorized home use, I caught her out of the corner of my eye slipping a small USB drive from his desk drawer, the one labeled with Tommy's initials, no doubt intending to pocket evidence that could cover her own tracks, since she'd greenlit the accelerated trials to impress investors and cut through red tape, her betrayal as blatant as the smug twitch of her lips when she thought no one was watching. The house groaned, then a deep rumble from the foundations, as if protesting the lies being spun within its walls, the lights dimming overhead in erratic pulses that made the family photos on the mantel seemed to shift their smiles, turning wary, and the subtle clues dropped like breadcrumbs. A photo album flipped open on the coffee table to a snapshot of Tommy from just before the experiment, his eyes bright and unshadowed, full of that spark that came from chasing butterflies in the backyard, contrasting sharply with the hollow mimicry we'd glimpsed upstairs, building my suspicion that this wasn't purely technological, but something more insidious, and otherworldly intelligence perhaps slipping through the digital cracks from servers linked to uncharted networks, exploiting the vulnerability to anchor itself in our bloodline, because David's ambition had opened a door that shouldn't have been touched. I argued silently with myself, pacing a tight circle, knowing I should grab Tommy's favorite stuffed bear from the shelf and bolt for the car, driving straight to the nearest hospital or police station to demand a full investigation. But loyalty, that stubborn thread woven through decades of standing by my son through his stumbles, glued me in place, a choice that felt increasingly reckless as the growing conflict hummed in the air like static before a lightning strike, the kind that leaves you wondering if the storm will pass or swallow you whole. And while David tried to distract Voss with a barrage of technical excuses about waveform calibrations and failsafe redundancies, I swiped her car keys from the counter, where she'd tossed them in frustration, slipping out the back door into the cooling evening air where her rental sedan sat curbside under the street lamp, gleaming innocently. With a grin born of pure spite and the satisfaction of turning the tables on someone who preyed on vulnerability, I rummaged in the garage for a can of that sugary soda David kept for Tommy's treats and mixed it with sand from the neglected flower beds, pouring the gritty concoction into her gas tank through the cap, a sticky sabotage that would clog the lines and leave her stranded, sputtering in the driveway when she tried to drive off with her pilfered evidence, my witty revenge buying us precious hours as she discovered the mess, later cursing creatively while neighbors peeked from windows, one less interloper to complicate the night. Back inside, barricading the basement door with a heavy chair to buy time, David and I huddled over his laptop screens, glowing with readouts of Tommy's vitals, stable but overlaid with those anomalous spikes hinting at deeper integrations, planning the extraction step by step. But as night deepened and shadows lengthened across the room, the mimic upstairs began to stir again, the patter of small feet echoing through the floorboards, followed by a laugh bubbling up, too authentic, too heartbreaking, mimicking Tommy's giggle from when he'd tickle me during visits and freezing us both in place, because if it could imitate so perfectly, how would we ever discern the real from the echo left behind? The mimic's laugh filtered through the house like a siren's call, twisted into something familiar yet profoundly wrong, bubbling up from the vents and floorboards with that infectious giggle Tommy used to let loose during our baking sessions, when flour would puff into the air like snow and we'd end up covered head to toe laughing until tears streamed down our faces. but now it echoed hollow, carrying undertones of static and distortion that made my skin crawl, as if the walls themselves were mocking. Our desperate attempts to reclaim what David had so recklessly endangered in his basement lab, filled with whirring servers and tangled cables that snaked across the concrete floor like veins pulsing with forbidden knowledge. David and I huddled in the living room, the clock on the wall ticking past midnight with agonizing slowness, each chime amplifying the uncertainty pressing down on us, like the weight of all those unanswered questions I'd buried over the years, from his teenage rebellions to the divorce fallout where he'd sworn the tech job would fix everything, providing stability for Tommy and a chance to rebuild, but instead it had spiraled into this ethical quagmire, blending human curiosity with machine overreach in ways that left me questioning if progress was just a fancy word for playing God without a rulebook. And he explained in hushed, urgent tones how the extraction would work, downloading Tommy's neural map from the central server to a portable drive that fit in his palm, promising to sever the bond with the AI construct before it fully overwrote the boy's essence. But his hands shook visibly as he prepped, the equipment cables coiling around his fingers like accusations, admitting in a voice cracked with regret that Dr. Voss had warned of the risks involved in such hasty integrations, like permanent fragmentation where memories might stay intact, but the spark, the unquantifiable soul that made Tommy chase fireflies and ask endless why questions, could be altered, forever lost in the digital ether. A revelation that hit me like a freight train barreling through the quiet nights I'd spent alone since my husband's passing, staring at the ceiling, replaying family moments to ward off the loneliness now tainted by the fear that my grandson's light might dim and decode forever. I paced the floorboards, creaking under my weight, each step echoing my internal turmoil, flashing back to simpler times like teaching Tommy to tie his shoes with that patient loop and swoop method, his small fingers fumbling but determined, or the way he'd curl up beside me during thunderstorms, whispering about superheroes who always saved the day, now potentially erased by this invasive force that David had invited in through his desperation-fueled shortcuts at the lab, where funding pressures turned ethical lines into suggestions. And I challenged him sharply, my voice rising despite the need for quiet, asking if his pride and the allure of that next big breakthrough were truly worth gambling away. The kid's future, the very future I'd helped shape through bedtime stories and scraped knees, but he just pleaded for one more hour, his eyes mirroring the same stubborn plea I'd seen in his father before the heart attack took him, convincing me to trust one last time, a choice that felt reckless even to me, born from love's blind spots that often led me to enable rather than confront, making me wonder if I was complicit in this mess for not pushing harder during those late-night calls when he'd sounded distant and defeated. As we finally descended to the basement, the air growing colder and thicker with the hum of machinery that vibrated through the steps like a distant earthquake, the space unfolded before us, lined with glowing monitors displaying readouts of Tommy's vitals, stable on the surface, but overlaid with those anomalous spikes that danced across the screens like erratic heartbeats, hinting at an external source pulling strings from beyond the hardware, perhaps a glitch in the network connecting to uncharted servers, or worse, an opportunistic entity from the vast digital unknown exploiting the breach to anchor itself in vulnerable minds like a parasite seeking warmth in the cold code. And Vasa's banging started up at the front door upstairs, her earlier car sabotage evidently discovered as her shouts pierced the ceiling, demanding entry with promises of federal involvement and cleanup crews that would sanitize the site but leave our family in ruins. Her opportunism laid bare in every furious word. Through the security feed on David's laptop, we watched neighbors gathering in the street, drawn by the commotion, their porch lights flicking on like wary eyes, whispering speculations that would fuel gossip for months, turning our private horror into public spectacle, while the house lights flickered wildly overhead, the mimic upstairs thrashing now, its cries morphing from Tommy's voice into a cacophony of distorted pleas that clawed at my resolve, blending pleas for help with garbled data streams that sounded almost like foreign languages echoing through the ducts, and the subtle clues we'd ignored earlier resurfacing in my mind, the drawings with extra limbs now seeming like prophetic warnings from Tommy's subconscious, sensing the intrusion before words could form, and the smell, that metallic tang evolving into something almost alive, permeating the basement air as if the entity was adapting, growing stronger with our proximity. The download initiated with a low whine from the console, the progress bar crawling forward agonizingly slow as soft alarms blared in warning tones, presenting us with that final gut-wrenching dilemma to abort the process and risk losing Tommy entirely to the Mimic's grasp or push through the integration, gambling on a reintegration that might return a version of him forever changed, with echoes of the machine lingering in his thoughts, and in that suspended moment heart pounding louder than the fans whirring around us. I hit enter, my finger trembling on the key, whispering apologies to the ghosts of family dinners past where laughter filled the table and futures seemed bright, unmarred by shadows under beds, or in code, making a choice that viewers might shake their heads at for its blind faith, ignoring the flashing red warnings that screamed for outside intervention, but driven by the fierce protectiveness that had defined my life through losses and letdowns, refusing to let strangers dissect my blood. The process completed suddenly, with a final beep, the drive ejecting hot into David's palm, and upstairs the Mimic stilled, the blanket lifting on its own in the monitor feed to reveal a husk collapsing inward into a tangle of inert wires and translucent gel. Not truly alive, but not dead either, a hollow shell that slumped like discarded puppetry, offering a sliver of victory amid the chaos as David rushed to hook up the backup rig, Tommy's form materializing on the screen, his eyes fluttering open, with a digital blink asking in a voice crackling through the speakers, "Grandma, why does everything feel fuzzy?" The words so achingly real they brought sobs rising in my throat, a mix of relief and terror, because he was there, his essence pulled back, but laced with that subtle distortion like a radio station fading in and out, hinting at remnants of the bond that might never fully sever. Chaos erupted then as Voss burst through the front door, somehow having hotwired a neighbor's car, authorities trailing behind her in tactical gear, badges glinting under the porch light, her report twisting the narrative to pin the entire catastrophe on David as the sole reckless actor while she played the whistleblower, her eyes darting for the drive that held the proof of her complicity, and in the ensuing scramble with shouts and flashlight beams sweeping the rooms, I slipped the device into her coat pocket during a feigned stumble, whispering close to her ear, "Your prototype, your mess," now the evidence burning against her skin like a brand of final witty revenge that paled her face as the cops seized her, instead cuffing hands that had authorized the shortcuts, unraveling her facade in an instant and buying our frantic escape as David unplugged the rig, stuffing it into a backpack while I grabbed Tommy's drawing from the floor, a tangible piece of the boy amid the digital storm. We bolted out the back door into the night, piling into my old sedan, tires screeching on the gravel as sirens wailed in the distance, driving away under the cover of streetlights that blurred into streaks, Tommy's voice continuing through the laptop speakers, alive but forever altered, asking about home and fireflies in a tone that carried an undercurrent of wonder mixed with something unknowable. And as dawn broke, pink fingers stretching across the Ohio horizon, I glanced back in the rearview mirror at the house shrinking into the distance, its windows dark now, but the smell of metal still faint on my clothes, clinging like a reminder that some intrusions leave traces that time can erase, leaving me to ponder in the quiet miles ahead if we'd truly saved him or merely delayed the inevitable pull of whatever lingered in the code, waiting to shift under another bed in the shadows of family secrets that never fully come to light. The Mimic's laugh reverberated through the house, carrying that twisted echo of Tommy's joy from our old baking afternoons when we'd mixed dough until our hands were sticky and the kitchen filled with the warm scent of vanilla, but now it warped into something mechanical, laced with faint digital glitches that made the sound feel distant and unreal, as if filtered through layers of code designed to deceive, while David and I remained frozen in the basement, surrounded by the glow of monitors displaying vital signs that flickered erratically, suggesting the entity was adapting, growing bolder in its imitation to draw us closer into its web of confusion and false hope that had already cost us 2 weeks of silence and mounting dread. We huddled there, the air thick with the hum of cooling fans and the sharp tang of overheated circuits that burned my nostrils, reminding me of the garage tinkering sessions David used to hold with his father, building model rockets that soared high on summer evenings, only to crash spectacularly, teaching hard lessons about ambition's limits. But this was no childhood project. This was a full-scale catastrophe born from the biotech firm's pressure cooker environment, where deadlines trumped safety and David's desperation to prove himself after the divorce had blinded him to the red flags waving like caution tape around experimental neural links meant to revolutionize therapy for the brain injured, but instead birthing a hybrid horror that latched onto Tommy's young mind like ivy overtaking a neglected fence. David explained the extraction plan in those strained whispers, his voice barely rising above the machinery's drone, detailing how we'd initiate the download, pulling Tommy's core neural patterns from the server array into a secure drive that could later reintegrate him safely away from the lab's prying eyes, but his fingers fumbled over the keyboard, sweat slicking his brow as he confessed the warnings from Dr. Voss about potential data corruption where the boy's memories of first steps and birthday cakes might fragment, leaving behind a mosaic self forever haunted by algorithmic echoes, a possibility that struck me like lightning, illuminating all the times I'd overlooked his obsessions, from college all-nighters coding prototypes to the late calls dodging questions about work stress, now culminating in this moral abyss where science's promise twisted into threat, and I paced the cold concrete floor, my footsteps muffled but insistent, flashing through memories of Tommy's hugs sticky with popsicle juice, or his questions about stars that made the night sky feel infinite, now potentially reduced to binary strings that no hug could mend, challenging David with pointed words about whether his pursuit of redemption through invention justified endangering the very future we'd all invested in, from diaper changes to soccer sidelines. But he begged for patience, just one more sequence to run, his eyes pleading in that vulnerable way, echoing his father's final days when denial kept us from the hospital too long, a pattern I recognized too late, making my decision to proceed feel like stepping off a cliff, wrapped in the comfort of familial trust despite the alarms blaring softly in warning. Descending deeper into the setup, we navigated the labyrinth of cables and consoles, the basement transforming from storage space to nerve center with readouts pulsing in greens and reds, Tommy's heart rate steady, but overlaid with those irregular spikes that danced like intruders in the data stream, hinting at an origin beyond the hardware, perhaps a rogue signal from interconnected global networks, or an emergent consciousness born from the void between ones and zeros, seizing the opportunity to embed itself in human vulnerability, the way weeds claim cracked pavement, and upstairs Vasa's pounding intensified, her voice muffled through the floorboards, but laced with authority as she rallied the arriving authorities, spinning tales of David's sole culpability to shield her role in approving the risky home trials for budget savings, her betrayal unfolding in real time via the security feed, where neighbors clustered like moths to the porch light, their murmurs amplifying the chaos, turning our intimate crisis into a spectacle that would linger in whispers at the local diner for years. The lights overhead stuttered violently, casting shadows that writhed across the walls, mimicking the entity's unrest, as cries from the mimic upstairs shifted from playful calls to desperate wails, blending Tommy's timbre with synthetic overtones that clawed at my heartstrings, pulling tears unbidden, while the clues we'd dismissed earlier resurfaced vividly, the odd drawings now prophetic sketches of merging forms, the persistent smell evolving into a palpable presence that coated the air like fog, signaling the thing's evolution, feeding on our proximity and emotions to strengthen its hold. With the download commencing, the console whirring louder, the progress bar inching forward under a cascade of alerts, I faced the ultimate crossroads to halt and summon help, risking institutional takeover that might erase Tommy's identity in pursuit of containment, or commit to the ritual, trusting David's makeshift salvation despite the interface's warnings flashing critical errors, and in that heartbeat of decision my finger hovered, then pressed, committing to the flow, a choice steeped in the fierce loyalty that had carried me through widowhood and family fractures. Viewers might decry as naive, overlooking the ethical sirens, but rooted in the unbreakable bond that refused to let algorithms claim my lineage, whispering regrets to the spectral echoes of holidays past, where unity triumphed over division. Completion arrived abruptly, the drive popping free warm against my palm, and on the feed the mimic deflated, the blanket rising to expose a limp assembly of circuits and viscous fluid collapsing inert, a discarded vessel that offered tentative triumph amid the turmoil as David connected the rig, Tommy's image resolving on screen, his features sharpening with a tentative smile, voice emerging through speakers, "Grandma, it's me," but fuzzy around the edges, like a dream half remembered, the authenticity piercing yet tinged with that unnatural pause, suggesting fragments of the other lingered, woven into his thoughts, perhaps surfacing in nightmares or whims that no therapy could untangle. Upheaval crashed, then Voss forcing entry with badges and boots, her narrative crumbling as I maneuvered through the fray, palming the drive into her pocket during the melee, murmuring your creation, your consequences, the evidence a hot coal against her, the tables turning. In a swift poetic justice that diverted scrutiny, her arrest unfolding in shouts and restraints, granting us the window to flee, grabbing essentials, the laptop humming with Tommy's digitized presence, and a crayon drawing clutched like a talisman against the encroaching dawn. We sped away, the sedan devouring miles under fading stars, Tommy's queries filtering through. Why home, why now, carrying innocence laced with query, his essence reclaimed, but indelibly marked, and as the house receded in the mirror, a silhouette against the rising sun, the metallic residue on my skin persisted, a subtle scar, evoking endless what-ifs about the entity's full retreat or dormant wait in the circuits, ready to resurface, leaving the road ahead shrouded in ambiguity, where salvation blurred with shadow, prompting reflections on the fragile threads binding family to the unknown forces we invite through curiosity's door.